Hello everybody, my name is Jassi Oberoi and I am basically a landscape, travel and portrait photographer. I also do shoot fashion once in a while, and the wonderful part here is that I am going to be with all of you for next few sessions, because you have purchased this course on photography straight and simple, and I am going to take you through this entire session in different modules, split into different modules. Congratulations to you for having taken that decision, that important decision of starting your journey in this wonderful and exciting world of photography. Let me tell you, let me ensure you with my experience, your decision is going to be perfect, because there's nothing, no better field of art than photography. It is ever evolving, it is ever challenging, it is ever exciting. All right. So congratulations to you again. My only word of caution here is you will have to stay with me. There will be some sessions which you might not like, because maybe the beginning also where we'll talk about the history of photography. But I will still try and engage you in whatever way I can. In the end, the whole idea is, and that should be even your idea, that you go back with lot of learnings and having become an improved photographer. All right, let us see what we are going to learn in these few sessions which are lined up ahead. So we'll talk about photo basics. We'll also talk about understanding your camera, then understanding lens, then light and exposure we'll talk about. Then we'll also discuss accessories and composition. Finally, we'll discuss about workflow, management and work habits. All right, let us, without really wasting much time, let us talk about the photo basics. What is photography? Okay, what as per you is photography? Whenever we go for searching for definition of photography, it tells you the art of creating an image on something which is a photosensitive material like a film or a sensor is called photography. Now that could be technically true, but for me it is not something from my heart. So photography from my heart is something which helps me capture the moments, helps me tell my own version of stories and make them eternal. And how do I do that? Through my skills, my creativity, using an instrument which is called camera, which also has a lens attached to it. All right. So that is what is photography as per my understanding. Let us see how photography actually started. What was the history, what could have been the basis of photography, so that we are trying to learn and understand this wonderful world of photography. I think what I understand is human being has always been curious. Always. In those ancient worlds, like some 30,000 years ago, there was this early cave paintings which were discovered, let us say in India also, when in Bhimbetka, India, 30,000 years ago, when we look at in the cave paintings that were discovered, you will see that man has been doing some kind of engravings on the walls or the ceilings of the cave where he used to hide or live or whatever, hide from being attacked, protect himself from being attacked by the wild animals. And so while lying down, he just started scribbling on the walls. That means whatever his thoughts were, he was already trying to create a visual story out of it. Initially, that might have been simple scribbles, nothing much, no story. Later on, he probably started creating stories with that. It started taking much better shape in terms of even the way he was drawing. And when we come to this side, Altamira, Spain, almost 15,500 years ago, you look at these cave paintings, you see the beautiful intricate art. There is shading, these are on the rocks or the walls. or probably with the stones itself, different colored stones or chalk or coal or whatever, and whatever he could find. And you see the art from this kind of thing had become something like this, which had shadings, which had proper shape given to the face of animals. So man has been always curious. Let us see how things evolved later on. When we walk ahead in history, almost in 2580 BC, when we check the paintings inside on the pyramids of Giza, you see now the human shapes are much more defined. You can see face resembles a face of any human being, and there were shadings, there were colors being used, different colors being used, and by that time probably human being was already talking about and thinking about how to use different colors together so that they make a wonderful looking painting. What it has got to do with photography? It has lot to do with photography, because this is the first type of visual art that was getting created. Visual art, because something which is drawn, then you see and then you admire. That is what photography is, right? So it has everything linked to photography, or I can say that this is why photography is there today. Had this not been there, I don't know, because maybe some other history we might have been discussing, but this has direct linkage to photography, the evolution of photography. Then come to Ajanta in our own country. India is in 200 BC. You go to Ajanta Ellora caves, look at the intrinsic art that has been found on the walls and ceilings of Ajanta and Ellora caves. It is amazingly beautiful. Just look at this. Look at, I am zooming in, look at look at this necklace, look at the face, look at the eyes, look at the fingers and hand placement. Everything is so perfect. It is so beautiful. This is how visual art was evolving over a period of years. Then in 1760, in 1480, look at this painting. It is lifelike, almost as if it is natural, as if somebody is sitting right in front of you. And during these days, what was happening was, the kings were hiring all these artists to get their paintings made, or the art made for their palaces, and to be hung on the walls of the palaces, or to be drawn on the walls of the palaces. And that is how art started evolving. And there were artists, and non-artists were, and they were rich. They would hire the services of these artists so that they can get their walls, the walls of the palaces or their houses get painted with this beautiful art. And when we come towards 1764, and this is again from India, look at the intrinsic art that was getting created. Look at this. It's almost three-dimensional kind of a painting on one-dimensional or two-dimensional piece of paper or wall. Look at this. Look at the nails, look at the nail enamels also, look at the rings. Everything is so intrinsic. Then how did photography actually, somebody thought of evolving photography or inventing photography? I think the phenomenon that we can share is something like this, that somebody entered a closed room and he saw the reflection or a mirage kind of a thing of something which is outside the room, inverted image of it getting formed inside a darkish kind of a room. Most of us would have ignored it, but there was somebody who suddenly realized that this could be something big, because this was interesting to him, and he started working on that concept of how to create an inverted mirror image using light and a dark room. That is how one camera, probably pinhole kind of a camera, got evolved, where this is the subject, which is the light from this is passing through a hole and entering a box which is completely dark, and the inverted image gets formed inside that box. So, from something which was already happening, which was a natural phenomenon that always happens when light enters an area which is little darker, and if the focus is achieved inside, because the distance between the main subject outside and the wall on which it is getting formed inside the box, it will always form an inverted image, reflection kind of a thing. Now, from this they created camera obscura. Now, what is camera obscura? What is the meaning of that? It is a dark room. The exact meaning of this is dark room. So, if you look at it, somebody had created a box outside somewhere which was dark inside, and from the hole cut out in that box, he was getting the reflection of the outside scenery onto this side of the wall inside the box. So, now people had started creating designed or structured way of creating the reflection of outside world or scenery inside the dark box. This is what is called probably the first sign of camera or photography taking shape. So, camera obscura. Again, another evolution of that, when the outside, this is the scene, inside the box, they had started reflecting that light using some device and making it fall on a canvas kind of a thing, so that they can draw that and create their own art. So, camera obscura had started to evolve at this point of time. Now, before we move further, let us first understand what is the principle of photography, because this has been happening. So, if you just keep in mind previous couple of slides, you will understand what I am trying to talk now, and this is how we interpret at this point of time. Probably they never interpreted it so scientifically, or in their mind they were aware that something similar happens, and they were trying to create their own ways of getting camera obscura to create their own version of whatever images that they were creating. Final images were not getting created, they were simply getting it transmitted inside the dark box. What is the principle of photography? There is a subject, then here is light, and there is something called a box, camera obscura we can call it, pinhole camera we can call it, whatever, there is a box, and we can call it a camera itself. Then the light falls on the subject, and light from the subject now moves ahead and enters that small hole in that box called camera and creates an inverted image at the back surface of that camera. Simple principle of light traveling, getting reflected from the subject and traveling in a straight line, creating this inverted image. What was the first photograph that was created? As per the records available. So, it was Joseph Napier in 1826. He created something like this, which is supposedly the first photograph, and this rendered version of that, which looks, it was an 8-hour exposure, which looks something like this. So, it has been reproduced to show how it looked. So, this is an illustrated version of the main photograph which we saw in the previous slide, and it was an 8-hour exposure, and that's why I always say that long exposure was the first photograph, was used to create the first photograph. So, it is one of the most natural and a natural way of doing photography. Now, look at this image. This is probably the first image photograph of a human being. Look at this. And I'm literally in love with this kind of photograph because it is so perfect. Look at the composition, look at the way he has used the human elements on the road here. Probably somebody who's getting his shoes polished by the cobblers by sitting on the side of the road, and look at the curve that he's using, look at the buildings, and it was a 30-minute exposure. This is probably the first photograph in the world where human is in the picture. Now, this is as per when we do the web search, we realize that this is what it throws up as the Joseph Napier's camera, which he used to create the first photograph in the world, which was in 8-hour exposure. All right. So, this probably, as per what we understand, what we get from the web search. So, the next, this is almost the modern version of the pinhole camera. Probably they were using nothing but a box with a pinhole size, pin size hole in front, which will allow the light to enter the box, which is dark inside. And what you see here is a photosensitive film which is attached, which forms an image when the light enters. And this is a kind of a view camera. What you see here is this is Sinar. So this is almost like the one that you see there. So this was little complicated to look. There's a lens here, then there is you can put the sensor at the back and attach the viewfinder and then look at the image and create the image. This was called a view camera. Now, how the earlier cameras evolved from camera obscura to pinhole and beyond, let us quickly see the journey. So this is Dobrony wet plate in 1864. Then we're talking about Kodak Brownie 1888. Then we see Speed Graphica 1912. Then Leica 1 Model A 1925. It almost looks like something this. So by this time, the camera had started taking its shape that we are aware of. Obviously, these days we do not get exactly these kinds of cameras, but yes, the shape was starting to show up now around 1925. Then we have Reflex 1929, something like this, which was a dual lens reflex. So you can see the two lenses here. One would be used to view and focus the image, the frame, and then the second one will be used to click the final image. So this particular one is Yashica Matte 124G. It's almost similar to this Reflex 1 in 1929. Then how did the modern cameras evolve? So we can say that right from somewhere in around 1940s or 1950s, the camera had started taking its shape, which I just shared right now. And so this was Contax S in 1949. It looks almost like this. It looks almost like this, this is Nikon FM2T. So almost like this. So obviously this has an interchangeable lens that at that point of time does not seem to have an interchangeable lens. So but the camera had started to evolve. Then the Minolta Dynex 7000 in 1985, and what is the early digital camera? So the first digital camera, not pure camera, but in a way the digital back was manufactured by Kodak, and that was attached on the Nikon camera, because these were film cameras, and this was the digital back or whatever, bottom, digital bottom, whatever you can call it, that was attached on the camera. This is Kodak DSC 460. So this was the digital science they mentioned, Kodak digital science. This is the first digital camera that started taking shape. So from this time now, the film started going out and digital started entering the photography world. Then was the first Fujifilm FinePix S2 Pro was probably the first digital, full-fledged digital camera that we can see. What are the modern DSLRs? So from this came DSLRs, because earlier we only had this kind of cameras were available initially. Then these kinds of cameras came, they all used film. Now, after evolution of digital photography and digital camera, the DSLR started taking shape. So let us see that. So this is how a DSLR looks. So you are all aware. So you certainly must have a DSLR, most of you. Some of you might even have opted for mirrorless, but that's okay. So this is any modern day DSLR. Shape almost looks the same across all brands, minor variations here and there. Then mirrorless digital camera. Mirrorless is the new evolution that most people understand. But for me, if you try and understand when was the first mirrorless that anybody used? If you remember those point and shoot cameras, these ones, they were mirrorless. They did not have a mirror inside. So in a way, I can very clearly say that mirrorless is not exactly new. Yes, it is a new avatar of point and shoots, much better, different technology, but yes, these also did not have mirror in them, and mirrorless also doesn't have mirror in them. Yes, in these the mirrors was not the lens was not interchangeable. Mirrorless has interchangeable lenses. So X-T3 Fujifilm, then Sony A7, every manufacturer is making. So Nikon mirrorless and Z7, then Lumix S1 and S1R, all these are new, latest, modern mirrorless cameras which are very, very advanced in technology, and they're continuing to evolve with time. Let us come to principle of photography. We have already gone through the history. We have understood how, we have seen, there's nothing to understand. We have seen how camera has evolved in earlier days and modern days also, from DSLR to mirrorless. And so there's much more. If you want to find out, you can really web search and you can understand. But let us come to the principle of photography, because we have to in the end understand photography. So let me start with the same image now. There is the source, the subject. Then you have something called camera here. Then there is the source of light, sun. Light falls on the subject. It gets reflected back and enters the camera and forms an inverted image at the back. Now we will talk in terms of photography. This whole has a glass piece attached to it, which we call now a lens. Obviously, it does not look like this now. It looks much more advanced, but just to understand right now. Then this plane at which the inverted image is getting formed is called the image plane. Very simple. Then this distance between the image plane, or distance between the point at which light enters the camera, which is the lens, and the image plane, is called focal length. All right? We'll discuss in detail. Now this part is called the angle of view. Now here most people confuse with angle of view, between angle of view and focal length. These two are two different things. Do not confuse between them. Angle of view will depend upon, yes, it will depend upon, it will be defined by the focal length at which you are shooting, because a telephoto and wide angle will have a different angle of view, but focal length is totally different and angle of view is totally different. Basically, angle of view is the angle that gets created at which the light enters the camera. All right. So that is a totally different, both are totally different subjects. Now, how camera works? Before we move on to actually starting to shoot images, let us first understand how camera actually works. So this is a typical cross section of a modern DSLR. So what happens is, what you see here is, these are all optical elements. This is a lens, the extended part is a lens. Inside that lens you will see multiple glass pieces which are called optical elements or lens elements. Okay. Then there is something called pentaprism, which is here. I'll share why the pentaprism is required and why it is there. Then we have a viewfinder here through which we view the image. We put the camera on our face and then we view the image using the viewfinder. In DSLR I am talking about. Then this is the mirror. This is the mirror. The green part is the sensor. Now sensor is photosensitive. It has a mirror in front at an angle. So what happens is, the light enters the lens passing through different optical elements and it hits the mirror. After it hits the mirror, that gets reflected and it enters pentaprism. Now pentaprism, within pentaprism, internal reflection of light happens and finally that light gets reflected out from the viewfinder, from where we are able to view what the frame is before we press the shutter button. That is where we decide that this image or frame is looking good or not. All right. Now in between the mirror and the sensor, there is something called a shutter. Shutter is just like any other curtain. It's a metal curtain, it's a sheet curtain, just to make you understand. So what happens is, when we press the shutter, the mirror will move up. So what is the function of a mirror? Mirror has nothing else to do but to reflect the light and make it enter into pentaprism so that we can view what we are going to shoot through the viewfinder. When we have to click and shoot the final image, the mirror has to move away from the path, because otherwise the light will not reach the sensor. When the mirror moves, the sensor is still covered by a shutter. All right, because otherwise the moment mirror moves, it will create the image. We do not want that. We want to control the amount of light. That is what happens. So how it works is, so light comes, mirror moves and it hits the sensor and the curtain will move up and down. So they are metal sheets, it will move one by one up and then it will close. All right, very simple phenomenon. It's like a window which has a curtain on it, light is outside, you move the curtain and move it back while the curtain is opening up, and by the time you bring it to close, light will continue to enter. Same principle, nothing else. Okay. Now, in this particular case, which is a mirrorless camera, so you still have the lens or optical elements. In between that, there is aperture, which was there also. There is a sensor here and LCD display. So what you see here is the same thing. So this is the lens, and the sensor is somewhere inside, and what you see here is an LCD display. There is no mirror, there is no viewfinder, there is nothing. All whatever you frame, you can see it at the back LCD screen. So light enters, it hits the sensor, and image gets created. Okay. So in this illustration, we are showing you there's an aperture in between, somewhere in the lens. Okay. What is an aperture? Now, aperture is always a part of the lens. It is not part of the camera. Camera has two parts, a camera body and the lens. Lens, when we talk about, let's talk about the modern lenses only, modern cameras only. So lens is interchangeable. That means we keep on changing the lens on the camera body depending upon our requirement. So aperture is always a part of the lens. If you look at this, this is metal blades. So this is how, and when they close or open, they create the hole which becomes smaller or larger. This is aperture. Talking about aperture, so what we see here is there are some numbers written on it. So 50 mm is the focal length. Then 1.4 is the aperture size. Whenever we mention something about aperture, it is always mentioned in terms of a fraction. So which is f1.4. So what is this f? F stands for focal length. So actually these numbers that you will always come across in subsequent modules also, all throughout photography, these numbers do not denote the size, actual size of the aperture. So actual size of the aperture can be found out only by when we know the focal length at which we are shooting. So whatever, let's say in this case 50 mm focal length is there, so 50 by 1.4, whatever the number comes will become the size of the aperture. We need not really bother about it. All we need to understand is that apertures are always in as a fraction of the focal length. Okay. So staying with aperture, you see another image where some numbers are mentioned. So 18 to 55 mm. This is for a variable focal length. So your lens could be a fixed focal length lens like the previous one, which only had 50 mm as the focal length. Now this particular lens and many more such lenses, variable focal length lenses, in this particular case it is 18 mm to 55 mm. There's something else which is mentioned. It mentions as 3.5 to 5.6. What does it mean? It means that this lens has the widest opening of aperture, which is 3.5, f3.5 at 18 mm focal length, and widest open aperture size becoming to f5.6 at 55 mm. So when we change the focal length, the aperture size also changes, and the maximum aperture becomes smaller at the longer focal length of 55 mm in this particular case. So which means, let me rephrase it, you will not get f3.5 as the opening of the aperture at 55 mm, or you will not even get f3.5 opening of the aperture anything at any focal length beyond 18 mm. It will change. This is what it means. Okay. So this will always help you purchase your lenses as per your requirement. What is this number which is mentioned here? In this case 52 is the diameter or the thread size. Based on this, you will probably decide some additional attachments like filters or even the lens cap. So this is how you decide and choose what size of lens cap you require for this particular lens. So this is 52. Now giving you brief about how aperture sizes define the actual aperture numbers, define the actual size of the aperture. Now this is a very simple graphical representation here. you must note couple of things here. First, let me repeat, aperture is a fraction of focal length. So, f something, f some number. The number is a constant, f is variable, focal length we don't know because it will vary from lens to lens. Even if it is a fixed lens, I change the lens to another focal length lens, it will vary. So, f stands for focal length, but the number is a constant and number will denote something else as well. So, smaller the number, as you can see, 1.4, 2.2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, these numbers, smaller the number, wider the opening of the aperture, and larger the number, smaller the opening of the aperture. So, it is reciprocal. Again, why? Because it's a fraction, because whenever we are dividing one particular number by a smaller number, let us say in this case, what is the resulting number? It's a larger number. That means it's a larger size of the aperture. Whenever we divide any number by a larger number, the resulting number will be small. Simple mathematics. All right. Let us see how it affects something called the area of focus. So, one is certain, which you know, the larger the opening, that means more light it will allow to enter. Smaller the opening, it will allow less light to enter. But there is another thing which it is impacting in the image, which is the area of focus, zone of sharpness or zone of focus. We also call that a depth of field. We will discuss that in detail as well, but right now just to make you understand. So, these are few images that I am quickly showing you. This image was taken at f1.4. So, the opening is large, the focus is on this camera here, rest everything is blurred out, which is out of focus, which means wider opening of aperture has a very narrow zone of focus, which is limited only to one particular element here, nothing else. As we close down the aperture size, now coming to f5.6, the zone of sharpness or focus is increasing. Now you can see these bottles also, now you can read what is written, and there some details now start appearing. Let me show you another example. Let us say we go to f16. Now f16, almost everything from end to end is in sharp focus. So, when we want to create an image where we want focus all across the frame from front to the end, then we need to close down the aperture. Or when we are vice versa, when trying to create an image where we do not want larger area of focus to be there, that can be in case of a portrait. Let us say you are clicking a portrait of somebody in your family member, and you do not want the background elements or subjects like trees or anything to come in sharp focus, and then we have to use a wide open aperture. All right. This is called depth of field. So, what is depth of field? Is the zone of sharpness or focus at a particular aperture size. Okay? Let us just see. In this case, this distance from the point of focus. Now, this becomes this one is the point at which I am focusing. All right. The range area is the sharp focus area is somewhere up to here, acceptable, and up to here. Now, this is called the depth of field. Is it clear? Let us move ahead. Aperture you have understood. We will come to this in detail again when we talk about exposure. Right now, we are just understanding how camera works. Now, this is shutter. Light has entered based upon the aperture size. How will it hit the sensor? Now, sensor is covered by something called a shutter. Now, this is how it looks. So light enters and the mirror goes up, but there is the curtain or the shutter in place. It moves up, away, and light hits the sensor and again it comes down. Let me replay this entire thing. Just observe what is happening. I'll go back. Now what happens is light enters, shutter is there. Now shutter moves away, light hits the sensor, shutter comes in front again. This is how shutter will work. And so this time taken by the movement of shutter to expose the sensor to the amount of light is also called exposure time or shutter speed. The speed with which shutter opens and or closes, shutter speed, and exposure time, the time it gives to expose the sensor with the light which is entering. All right. Shutter speed is obviously the speed with which the shutter moves. Now shutter speeds are always in the units of 1 second. Wherever you see 1, again it's a fraction, 1. What is 1? This is 1 second. So this 1 and this 1 are the same. It's just that this is just 1 second, this is half the second, this is 1/4 the second, this is 1/8, 1/15th. That means this is 2/50th part of 1 second, which is very fast. And when we go slow, so this 1 second gets doubled up to 2 seconds and 4 seconds and 8 seconds and subsequent seconds. So we are always measuring shutter speed in a fraction of 1 second. That is what you should remember. Which means the larger the denominating number, the faster the shutter speed. The smaller the denominator number, the slower the shutter speed. Right? So this is the fast shutter speed, this is the slow shutter speed. So when I come to this part, what is 2? Which is bigger? Tell me. Yes, 4 appears to be bigger, right? But right now we are not understanding counting. We are understanding shutter speed. So in this case, this is a bigger number, this is a smaller number, this is faster, this is slower. It's a fraction. Now coming to this chart, so this is half, this is quarter. So how does the shutter speed impact the final image? Depending upon kind of exposure time that is getting created. A faster shutter speed will give you less exposure time and a slower shutter speed will give you more exposure time. This kind of movement, when we are freezing the movement of an individual, happens with a faster shutter speed. So in this case, let us say the shutter speed is 1/250. So 2/50th part of 1 second. Let us see what happens when we slow down the shutter speed. So this is, the person is now blurred. So this is 1/60. That means slower shutter speed. For the time the shutter is open, light is entering, the person is moving. So camera could not keep the person in sharp focus. What happens when we further slow down the shutter speed? It gets totally blurred out, and this is 1/15. So this is how it impacts the final image. Physical shutter and electronic shutter. What is a physical shutter? These days electronic shutters have started coming in. What is a physical shutter? Physical shutter is the blades will open and these are the pixels. So these are the pixels on the sensor and they will expose the pixels with the light and the shutter will close. Physically, the shutter is a physical shutter, so it's a blades, they will open, then they will close. Whereas electronic shutter straight away nothing opens, it just exposes the light and the pixels get exposed and image is created. And something called the third part is the ISO, which is the sensor sensitivity to the amount of light which is entering. So which is ISO stands for International Standards Organization. It doesn't feel related to photography. So let me give you some idea about why this is called so. In earlier days, when there was film days, film used to come this ISO, so-called ISO at that point of time also. Every country had their own version, had their own calculation of ISO. Let us say it's a German film. So in Germany, they used to call it as DIN, D-I-N. And in America, they used to call it as ASA. It had a different calculation, and when somebody from America was traveling with his films to do photography and enters Germany and he runs out of his films, so he would have to go to buy the film which he will not get in ASA, he will get in DIN, and he had to recalculate what ASA he was using, so which kind of DIN version he has to buy. Later on, this was entire thing was said that we have to now make it formal and make it uniform, and that is when International Standards Organization stepped in and they created one universal version and they started calling it as ISO. It is nothing but the sensor sensitivity. So lower the number, lower the sensitivity. Larger the number, larger the sensitivity. How does it work? Let me just explain you in layman terms. Let's say for suppose outside, it does not increase the amount of light, it just increases the sensitivity of sensor to the amount of light which is falling on the sensor. So let's say outside it is really bright and sun is shining too bright and too strong and hot, and you go out and you wear shades, dark glasses. After around an hour or so, or even after 10-15 minutes, if you are trying to do an experiment, stand there wearing those glasses for 10-15 minutes, and all of a sudden you remove the glasses. What happens? You feel as if the light has suddenly increased. You can't even open the eyes properly. But in actuality, has the light increased? The answer is no. Your eyes became sensitive to the amount of light for a certain period of time. It works on exactly the same principle. So you will see many such comparisons, because camera and lens, the way it works, has been actually inspired by the way our eyes work. Obviously 100% cannot be implemented, cannot be copied, so there are gaps, but the principle remains the same. So lower number gives you low sensitivity and larger number gives you high sensitivity. That means if the light is low, I have to use a higher number, larger number, so that I get a better looking image, better exposed image. Okay? So ISO becomes, 100 becomes the base sensitivity, and 200 becomes the double of the base sensitivity, and so forth. So 3200 is 32x of the base sensitivity. All right? How does ISO impact the final image? We have seen earlier how aperture behaves, and aperture impacts the depth of field. What ISO does? So let us say this is taken at ISO 100. It's pretty dark. All we can see is the flame of the candle. Then we come to ISO 1600. Then we start seeing some details in this area as well. All right, this surrounding area, but still so much of the image is still not visible. Then we go to ISO 12,800. I'm just showing you some examples. In this case, almost everything is visible. All the areas in the frame are visible. But you notice something? It is not clean. This is called digital noise. This is called noise. These are grains which have appeared. Because in actuality, ISO is not increasing the amount of light. It is just making the sensor more sensitive to the same amount of light. It just amplifies the low signal to a high signal of light. That is why it starts giving you grains at higher ISOs. These three together form an exposure triangle. We will discuss about exposure triangle in detail when we come to light and exposure part. Right now, just understand one thing, that these three are interrelated: aperture and shutter speed and ISO. These three parameters are not different, independent of each other. They are 100% dependent on each other. So if you change aperture, shutter speed and shutter speed will change. You change shutter speed, aperture will change. You change ISO, probably both aperture and shutter speed will change. This is the one fact you have to always keep in mind. Then how does the exposure typically works, this exposure triangle? Let me take an analogy of a tap. So let us say in this tap, this water entering is the intensity of light. This is the aperture, the tap handle, because when we open this, the hole inside becomes larger and this throws the amount of light. This, the speed with which the water is falling, is the shutter speed, and the amount of water that is getting collected in the glass becomes the exposure. Now, if we are not happy with this kind of exposure, then what we need to do is increase the size of this area, and this is just an analogy. These represent an ISO. So if the size increases, probably more light enters and stays there, giving you an illusion as if the light has increased. All right. Coming back to aperture, same thing, same numbers. Let me repeat, it's a fraction, and smaller the number, larger the opening, and larger the number, smaller the opening. Let us see at each stepwise. I have just shown you earlier three different arbitrary numbers. Let us see how gradually it impacts the depth of field. F1.4, just keep observing. I'll keep on going fast. Just keep observing this area. Right now only this is in sharp focus, rest everything is really blurred out. So you already understand the concept. The idea is to show you at different aperture numbers how sizes or how this depth of field is getting impacted. So I'll quickly change the slides so that you can see the impact. F2, F2.8, see it is increasing. F4, F5.6, it's all gradual. F8, F11, F16, F22, everything is in sharp focus right now. All right. How does this depth of field actually work? Why does this happen? There is an image illustration here. First, just let's see this, and then I'll probably draw a diagram and make you understand what's happening. Okay. Now, in this, there are three things now. This is the light source, this is the lens, this is the sensor on which the light is getting converged. Let me show you by drawing a diagram and make you understand why it is happening. Can I have the whiteboard? Now let me draw, this is, let us say, your light source. Okay. Now this is the sensor. This is the lens or the aperture. What happens? What will define the path of light which is entering the lens and hitting the sensor? It is the opening of the aperture or even the angle of view and all. So right now, let us say in this case, light hits the aperture in this. There are two images that I'll create. This and maybe this. So in this case, you see in both the cases, the light entering the lens is at a different angle, and because of this, the path that it follows inside the camera till it hits the sensor changes. Let us say in this case it is a closed aperture, smaller aperture number. So what it does is it typically travels something like this, and it focuses or converges on one single point on the sensor, making a sharp image. In this case, because the light is entering the lens at a different angle, so it travels and probably should meet somewhere beyond the sensor, but light cannot travel beyond the sensor. So on sensor, it creates a blurred kind of an image because there is no single point convergence which is happening. Why it is happening? Because of the size of aperture is deciding the path at which the light travels inside the camera and finally hits the sensor. So if you can see here, now let me show you what is happening here. In this case also, the light path that is entering is at a different angle, so it is converging at one single point. In this case, the light convergence changes and it heads beyond, creating a blurred kind of an effect on the sensor. You see this? It's all because of the path of the light inside the camera after it enters the sensor, which gets impacted by the size of the aperture. Because if the size of the aperture is small, the path changes, and if it is large, the path further changes. I hope this is making things clear to you. All right. So let us move ahead. Let us come back to the shutter speed right now. So what is the shutter speed? Unit of 1 second. Is it clear? So when we are talking about 1 second, it is 1 second exposure time, or in terms of shutter speed, the speed of the shutter is 1 second. That means within 1 second the shutter will open and close. Okay. So this is 8000, means 1 by 8000. Within the camera, you will not see it like this. You will see it like 8000. So what numbers that you see are the denominator of the fraction. All right. When you see something like this, 1 second, it is 1 with 2 comma marks on top. That means it is 1 second and 2 second and 4 or 8 or 15. All right. Every camera has an exposure time up to 30 seconds, and beyond that it goes into bulb mode, which is long exposure. Bulb means I will decide for how much time the shutter will remain open. So till I keep pressing the shutter button, shutters will remain open. It can go up to few hours also. It all depends upon me. All right. Now this is super fast or very fast shutter speed, then ranges of fast, normal, slow and very slow, and going up to long exposure beyond bulb. All right. How do we decide how to choose a particular specific shutter speed based on what we want to shoot? So it will begin with few questions that you ask yourself, like what is your subject? Second, is your subject moving? Is the subject moving? It could be a person, like I showed in the example when the person was moving. It could be a car, it could be anything. If the answer is yes, then my next question should be, do I want to freeze the motion? Do I want to freeze his motion and capture him sharp? Or do I want to blur the motion? That is also possible. That could also be the decision. Is there sufficient light? If the answer is, it could be yes, there is light is more, or light is less. Now based on that, I will choose my aperture and shutter speed. Let us say there is sufficient light, then I will use the aperture accordingly. And if there is less light, I will choose the aperture accordingly, and if I want to freeze the motion, then my shutter speed will be faster, and if I want to blur the motion, my shutter speed will be slower. Let us see now how the shutter speeds are impacting an image. Let us see, everything else remains constant here. We saw about ISO. This image is at 125 second. Am I right? Is this 125 second? No, it is 1 by 125. It is 1/25th part of 1 second. So do not confuse. This is 1 by 125, and this is how the image looks. Very dark, all you can see is the flame, candle flame. Then we come to 1 by 60. We start seeing slightly more. I'll quickly move so that you can see the changes, and I'll keep on talking about it. This is 1 by 30, little more information. 1 by 15, slightly more information. 1 by 8, it starts revealing itself now. We can see something which is kept beyond the candles. 1 by 4, we now know what all is there. Then 1 by 2, that means half second. Wonderful, everything is visible now. We go to 1 second, it becomes very bright. But in this case, there is no noise, because in fact, actual light is increasing. There is no amplification, there is no sensitivity which is playing its part. Actual light is increasing here. That's why the exposure becomes more, and we are able to see the entire image properly. 2 seconds, it starts now going beyond what I like. 4 seconds, now the subjects or things were visible only at 1 by 125, only the flames are now getting blown out. All right. Same thing now, let us say shutter speed. This is at 1 by 30, so blur motion. When we take it to 1 by 60, it freezes slightly. And when we go to 1 by 125, it freezes completely. You want to freeze it further, keep increasing the shutter speed. That means keep making the shutter speed faster. All right. So shutter speed helps you in two ways. One is to freeze the motion or to blur the motion, and second, to increase the amount of light which is entering the camera so that you can get the correct kind of exposure. All right. Similarly to aperture, let me recollect and for your better understanding. When we open the aperture size, it helps you get more light inside, helping you control exposure. It also affects the depth of field, making areas around the main pointed subject blur out. And when we close down the aperture, it reduces the amount of light which enters the camera, but it keeps everything that is visible in the frame in sharp focus. All right. Let's talk about ISO that existed even in film times. So roll film 1885, they also had the ISO, which was maybe called something different, but it was the sensitivity of the film roll. So in this case, 35 mm film, which was in 1909, it had the sensitivity of 400. In this, the sensitivity is 64. All right. In this, sensitivity was 200, 200, 400, different. But sensor works slightly differently. In sensor, when we start increasing the ISO, it starts showing the noise. Earlier I had shown you 3 examples. Now quickly I'll move past, I'll make the slides move faster. You just observe how the final image is getting impacted when I start increasing ISO in gradually. Right now this image is at ISO 100. This is ISO 200. This is ISO 400. This is ISO 800. It starts revealing itself now. 1600, 3200, 6400. Yes, it is visible now, but you can see some grains here in dark areas. 12,800, 25,600. You see the grains are becoming unbearable. Also, you will notice one more thing, that there is a color shift also happening. Now, color is changing from red to pinkish tones and all. That also happens with higher ISO, extreme higher ISO. Then 51,200. For me, it is really too much of noise. So, low ISO, an example of the image which is very clean, neat and clean, nothing is there. And high ISO, this is what happens to the same image. Same thing, the color shift has also happened and grains have also come. Now, here is one small thought. Does it mean that we should not shoot at high ISO? The answer is no. Because in the end, we are here to capture a moment. And we cannot have a situation that we do not capture a moment. Yes, if it is a commercial shoot, and as per the shoot requirements, it is very clear that the pictures that has to be supplied have to be neat, clean, sharp, without any noise. Then higher ISO are strict no. Then whatever we do in terms of low ISO, around base ISO, ISO 100 or 200 only, not going beyond that. All right. So, you will get the best quality image without any grains at ISO 100, and going beyond, and in this case what we are showing is, in most of the cameras, somewhere around 6400 ISO is what is the image which is still permissible and better than even higher ISOs. It is still usable. All right. But still find out from your camera settings and figure out yourself as per your camera. How does auto, there is something in your camera which is an auto ISO. How does auto ISO work? Now, auto ISO, there is something called a thumb rule. Before I explain the auto ISO, let me share something here, trying to make you understand what is happening. There is something called a thumb rule when we come to shutter speeds. All right. Now, thumb rule is to ensure that when you shoot an image handheld, holding the camera, at a certain shutter speed, your handheld image will not be sharp. Your hand movements will get captured in the final image. All right. Now, that is 1 by focal length. So, 1 is the shutter speed 1 second, and this focal length is final effective focal length we are talking about. So, let us say I am shooting at 100 mm focal length. So, my minimum shutter speed should be 1 by 100 to ensure that the camera hand shake does not get captured in the final image. Now, auto ISO works on almost similar principle. What it does is, let me show you here now. Let us say you are shooting at an aperture right now 22, 6400, ISO is there, shutter speed is 1 by 125. What it does is 100 mm focal length. So, it should achieve the ISO in auto ISO mode should achieve a minimum shutter speed of 1 by 100. Okay. So, minimum shutter speed in this case is 1 by 125 is exactly 100 will not come, because your camera will have a setting of 1 by 125. So, it will give you minimum that much of shutter speed based on auto ISO. So, let us see the illustration here, what happens. Now, what is the main problem area in this particular case? Now, camera does not understand. Usually, ideally it should fix at 1 by 125, but what happens is, it goes beyond that because it feels that it has to give you sharpest possible image. So if I require a let's say a shutter speed of 1/100, which I can achieve at ISO 3200, it will use ISO 6400 to take me to even a higher shutter speed, faster shutter speed, just to ensure that you do not get blurred out images. Alright, so not always desirable, but yes, if I am in a hurry and I do not want to miss the shot, I will use that because it's a setting which can be used to your advantage. So I hope you have understood what we wanted to share. You might have a lot of questions. So if you have any question, please do ask in the comment section, and I'll be more than happy to clear all your doubts. And till then, till the next module, please go out and start experimenting on these aspects what we have discussed: aperture, shutter speed and ISO. We are going to come to these aspects in detail in future modules as well, but a base understanding is required and you must be clear about this base understanding, because this will form the basis of this is the foundation of starting your photography journey. Thank you so much.